They say a man reveals his true character at the table, what he orders, how he treats the people who serve him, whether he notices the hands that pour his wine or sees only the wine. Colonel Harlan Beaumont Haines never once looked at my hands in 27 years. Tonight, that will be the last mistake he ever makes. My name is Solomon. I am 51 years old. I have been the head butler of Haines Grove Plantation in Albemarle County, Virginia, for 27 years. I have arranged 492 dinners. I have polished silver I will never own. I have poured wine I will never drink. I have stood invisible in the corner of a dining room while men decided the fates of other men and never once imagined I was listening. Tonight is Colonel Haines's retirement banquet. 40 guests. The finest food in 3 counties. The silver that has been in the family since 1802, each piece engraved with the Haines crest. A hawk with its wings spread over a broken chain. The irony of that crest has never been lost on me. They will eat and drink and toast the Colonel's 40 years of tobacco wealth. They will praise his business acumen, his civic contributions, his Christian virtue. They will drink to his health and his legacy and his future of leisure. They will say he is a great man, and by morning every single thing they are celebrating tonight will be gone. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a butler becomes a weapon. Let me tell you what 27 years of invisibility teaches a man. Let me tell you about the night Colonel Harlan Haines discovered that the most dangerous person in any room is the one no one ever bothers to see. I arrived at Haines Grove in 1827. I was 24 years old, purchased at an auction in Richmond for $650, a price Colonel Haines negotiated down from $800 by pointing out a small scar on my left hand from a childhood burn. He was proud of that negotiation. He mentioned it at dinner parties for years afterward as an example of his shrewd business sense. The scar came from pulling a child out of a cooking fire when I was 9. He never knew that. My previous owner, a tobacco merchant named Graves, had trained me as a domestic servant since I was 15. I knew how to set a formal table, how to serve wine without dripping, how to manage household staff, how to remain in a room without seeming to occupy space. These skills made me valuable. They also made me invisible in ways that would take me years to fully understand and exploit. Colonel Haines was 38 years old when he purchased me, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical confidence that comes from never having been told no. He was the second generation of Haines wealth, inheriting 2,400 acres from his father, along with 89 enslaved people, and a debt he'd spent 20 years eliminating. By the time I arrived, the debt was gone, and the acreage had expanded to 3,800. He was proud of this expansion the way some men are proud of their children. The land was his legacy. The tobacco was his identity. His wife, Margaret, was a thin, quiet woman who read constantly and said little. She'd given him 2 sons, Harlan Jr. and Douglas, and 1 daughter, Caroline, before deciding, apparently, that she'd fulfilled her marital obligations. She lived in a separate wing of the house and communicated with her husband primarily through notes. I delivered those notes for 27 years. I read every one. The sons were different creatures entirely. Harlan Jr. was 19 when I arrived, already his father's replica in both appearance and temperament. Douglas was 17, softer, more thoughtful, occasionally kind to the people enslaved on the property in ways that cost him nothing but meant something anyway. Caroline was 14, already being prepared for a marriage that would consolidate 2 prominent Virginia families. I learned them all within the first month. Their habits, their preferences, their fears, their secrets. I learned that Colonel Haines took 2 glasses of bourbon before dinner and 3 after. I learned that Harlan Jr. visited the slave quarters on Thursday nights and that everyone knew except his father. I learned that Douglas kept a journal under his mattress where he wrote things that would have disturbed his father considerably. I learned that Margaret was not reading novels as she claimed, but correspondence with a cousin in Philadelphia who held abolitionist sympathies. I learned these things because I was invisible. Because when a butler stands in the corner of a room holding a decanter, people forget he is a person. They forget that persons listen. They forget that persons remember. I filed everything away, not with any plan in those early years, simply because information felt like the only thing I could accumulate that couldn't be taken from me. Land could be sold, family could be separated, body could be broken, but knowledge, stored carefully in a mind they'd never thought to examine, was mine absolutely. The first crack appeared in 1831. Her name was Clara. She was 26, a seamstress, enslaved since birth on a neighboring plantation before being purchased by Colonel Haines to manage the household sewing. She was small and precise in her movements, with hands that could mend anything and eyes that noticed everything. She reminded me of myself in that way. We recognized each other immediately, the way people do when they've developed the same survival skills in the same impossible circumstances. We were careful. Relationships between enslaved people were permitted, sometimes even encouraged by owners who understood that families meant stability, and stability meant productivity. But attachment was a vulnerability, and vulnerability was something Colonel Haines exploited without malice and without thought, the way a man might use a hammer. Not cruel, simply utilitarian. Clara and I built something quietly over 3 years. Conversations stolen in the kitchen passage after dinner service, walks on Sunday afternoons when the Colonel's family attended church, small exchanges of information and trust that accumulated into something neither of us had planned for or fully permitted ourselves to name. In the spring of 1834, Clara told me she was carrying my child. I remember standing in the linen closet where we'd been sorting tablecloths and feeling the world rearrange itself around that single fact. Joy and terror arriving simultaneously, indistinguishable from each other. We told no one. Clara continued her work. I continued mine. We watched her body change through the summer and tried not to imagine futures that seemed dangerously close to hope. Our son was born in October 1834. We named him Joseph in private, though the household register recorded him simply as male, born October, mother Clara, father unknown. That unknown was deliberate. Named fathers could be sold separately. Unknown fathers gave a child the thin protection of mystery. Joseph lived for 14 months. He died of fever in December 1835, in the small cabin where Clara slept, while I stood outside unable to enter because house slaves were not permitted in the field quarters after dark without permission. I hadn't had time to request. I stood in the cold Virginia night and listened to my son die through a wooden wall and could not reach him. Clara never fully returned from that grief. She continued working. She continued living. But something essential had been extinguished in her, and I watched it happen daily with the helplessness of a man in chains made of nothing visible. In March 1836, Colonel Haines sold Clara to a planter in Kentucky. He mentioned it at breakfast while I poured his coffee. Sold the seamstress to Whitfield. She'd been getting melancholy since the infant died. Change of scenery will do her good. He said it the way he might mention selling an underperforming horse. His attention returned immediately to his newspaper. I poured his coffee without spilling a drop. I said, "Yes, sir." I walked back to the kitchen and stood over the wash basin and breathed until my hands stopped shaking. That was the morning I began to plan. Not immediately, not with fire or fury, with patience. The same patience that had made me valuable turned now toward a different purpose. I had understood since my first month at Haines Grove that Colonel Haines's real power, the foundation beneath the land and the tobacco and the social standing, rested on 4 things. His reputation. In Albemarle County, the Haines name meant integrity, prosperity, and influence. He sat on the county court. He helped found the local agricultural society. He was a deacon at the Presbyterian church. Men trusted him with business, with judgments, with the kind of informal power that Virginia's planter class ran entirely on. Destroy his reputation, and you destroyed his ability to function in the world he'd built, his business relationships. Colonel Haines did not operate alone. He was embedded in a network of tobacco factors, merchants, creditors, and buyers that stretched from Richmond to London. These relationships required trust, required confidentiality, required the belief that Harlan Haines was the man he presented himself to be. I had sat in the corner of his study for 27 years while he conducted this business. I knew the details of every arrangement, every side deal, every corner cut, every promise made and broken. His family mythology, the Haines family story, as Colonel Haines told it, and as Virginia society accepted it, was one of honorable enterprise, Christian virtue, and paternal benevolence toward the enslaved people on his property. He genuinely believed this story. More importantly, his children believed it, his neighbors believed it, and the church he attended every Sunday believed it. The mythology was more valuable than the tobacco because it could not be burned or flooded or struck by blight. And his retirement. Colonel Haines had spent 5 years planning this transition. He was 65 years old, his health was declining, and he had constructed an elaborate arrangement for handing the plantation's management to Harlan Jr. while retaining ownership and income. Lawyers had been involved. Documents had been signed. The banquet tonight was the public celebration of a private transition that had already legally occurred. By morning, the paperwork would be filed in the Albemarle County Courthouse. Colonel Haines's retirement was meant to be his monument, his proof that he had built something lasting. 4 pillars. 27 years of invisible listening had given me the material to demolish all 4 simultaneously. Not with fire, with truth. I had an ally I'd never expected. Douglas Haines, the younger son, was 44 years old now. He had managed the plantation accounts for the past decade, working alongside his father, while his brother, Harlan Jr., focused on the social and political dimensions of tobacco wealth. Douglas had his mother's quiet nature, and, as I'd known since reading his journal in 1828, his mother's secret sympathies. He had never acted on those sympathies. He was too careful, too afraid, too embedded in a life that required him to be his father's son. But the knowledge was there, stored in a man who had spent decades watching the same things I'd watched from different corners of the same rooms. In January 1854, I approached Douglas in the account room late on a winter evening, when the house was quiet and his father had retired early with a headache. I had never, in 27 years of service, initiated a personal conversation with any member of the Haines family. The shock on his face confirmed he understood immediately that whatever I was about to say existed outside all normal boundaries. "I require 20 minutes of your time, Mr. Douglas." I said it quietly, the way I said everything. "What I have to tell you will interest you considerably." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he closed the account book and gestured to the chair across from his desk. I sat. For the first time in 27 years, I sat in the presence of a Haines. I told him what I knew, not everything. A carefully selected portion designed to accomplish a specific outcome. I told him about the letter his father had written in 1849 to the tobacco factor in Richmond, Thomas Aldridge, adjusting the weights on last year's tobacco bales by 8% in the documentation while delivering full weight to a competitor's factor to secure a preferential rate. Fraud. Not ruinous fraud, but fraud documented in a letter that I had read over his father's shoulder and memorized word for word. I told him about the arrangement with Judge Carver of the county court, 3 cases over the past decade, in which Colonel Haines's testimony had been exchanged for favorable rulings on property disputes. I had heard those arrangements made in this very room, whispered over bourbon, finalized with handshakes I had witnessed while refilling decanters. I told him about the deed. The 200 acres on the property's northern edge transferred to Harlan Jr.'s name in 1851 in a private arrangement that bypassed the formal accounting Douglas managed. 200 acres generating income that appeared nowhere in the books Douglas kept. Douglas's face went through several stages as I spoke: disbelief, recognition, anger. Then something more complicated that I recognized as the expression of a man discovering that the world he'd accepted as true requires fundamental revision. When I finished, the room was silent except for the fire settling in the grate. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. "Because the retirement banquet is in 8 months. Because your father is about to formalize a transfer of power that rewards a lifetime of arrangements you don't know about and punishes your honesty by keeping you ignorant. And because I need something from you in return." "What could you possibly need from me?" I told him. His face changed again. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, I'll need to verify what you've told me, of course. I placed 3 documents on his desk. Letters I had removed from the Colonel's private files over the previous 6 months, copied in my own hand, and returned before they were missed. The originals remained where they belonged. What I gave Douglas were perfect reproductions, written in the darkness of my room during the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning, lit by a single candle stub. Evidence he could verify against records he had access to. Evidence that would hold up to scrutiny. Douglas looked at the documents for a long time without touching them. Then he picked up the first one and began to read. The 8 months between that January conversation and the September banquet were the most carefully constructed of my life. Douglas verified everything I'd told him. It took him 3 months, working quietly through account books and county records and private correspondence, to confirm that his father's business history contained the irregularities I'd described. When he finished, he came to find me in the butler's pantry, where I was polishing silver. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then he said simply, "It's all true, yes sir, all of it. Every detail I provided you." He was quiet for a moment. "My father is going to be celebrated as a great man in 3 months. Every important family in 3 counties will be in that dining room drinking to his legacy." "Yes sir. And you want me to let you serve that dinner?" "I want considerably more than that," I said, "but yes, I want to serve that dinner. What I want in return," I reminded him, "is what we discussed in January." He nodded slowly. He'd had 3 months to make peace with it. I'd chosen him carefully. A man who had spent decades accumulating quiet guilt needed only the right circumstances to convert that guilt into action. "I'll have the documents prepared by August," he said. "Legal, properly witnessed, filed with a lawyer in Richmond who has no connection to this county. For all of them." "For all of them," he confirmed. 89 people. "It will take time and considerable money from accounts my father doesn't scrutinize closely." "I understand." I returned to polishing the silver. The candlesticks caught my reflection, stretched and distorted in the curved metal. A butler's face in a Haines candlestick. Invisible until you looked directly at it. "Thank you, Mr. Douglas." He left without another word. The banquet menu had been planned for 6 weeks. Mistress Margaret, emerging briefly from her wing of the house for this occasion, had consulted with me on every detail. She wanted perfection. She wanted 40 guests to leave, convinced that Haines Grove represented the pinnacle of Virginia hospitality and civilization. I gave her exactly what she asked for. Turtle soup to begin, prepared from the Colonel's personal recipe, a dish he served only on the most significant occasions, followed by a remove of roasted duck with cherry sauce, alongside braised celery and creamed corn. Then the main course, a whole roasted pig, slow-cooked since 4 in the morning, presented on the largest silver platter in the household, surrounded by sweet potatoes and preserved fruits, cheese and biscuits to follow, and for dessert, 3 types of cake, a syllabub, and a selection of preserved fruits and nuts alongside coffee and port. The wine list I curated personally. Colonel Haines kept an exceptional cellar, accumulated over 30 years. I selected bottles appropriate to each course, moving from lighter whites through the duck to heavier reds with the main course, finishing with the best port in the cellar for toasts. Everything would be perfect. The food, the wine, the table settings, the service. And every important person in Albemarle County would be present to witness what happened after dessert. The guests arrived at 6 in the evening. September had brought cool weather and clear skies, and Haines Grove looked exactly as Colonel Haines had always wanted it to look. Candles in every window, torches along the drive, the great house illuminated against the evening sky like a painting of everything Virginia's planter class believed about itself. I stood at the entrance and received them, Judge Carver and his wife. Thomas Aldridge, the tobacco factor from Richmond, traveled down specifically for the occasion. Reverend Morrison from the Presbyterian Church, the Randolph family from the neighboring plantation, the Whitfields from across the county, the Cunninghams, the Porters, the Flemings, the Marshalls, 40 people in their finest clothes, arriving to celebrate a great man's legacy. I took their coats. I directed them to the parlor for pre-dinner drinks. I moved among them with wine and small delicacies prepared by the kitchen, and I listened, as I always had, to everything. They talked about Colonel Haines with the warmth reserved for men who have successfully made other men wealthy. They talked about his tobacco yields, his business judgment, his contribution to county affairs. They said he was the kind of man Virginia produced at its best. They said his retirement was well earned. They said they hoped his sons would carry on his legacy with equal distinction. Colonel Haines himself stood at the center of every conversation, a glass of bourbon in hand, his large frame still carrying authority even as age had softened it. He was gracious and expansive and completely at ease, a man in the final act of a performance he'd been rehearsing his entire life. He caught my eye once across the parlor, the way he occasionally did when he wanted to convey satisfaction with the arrangements. I gave him the small nod that meant, "Everything is in order, sir. Everything is proceeding exactly as planned." He smiled and returned to his guests. I went back to the kitchen to oversee the final dinner preparations. We sat them at 7:30. 40 people arranged along the extended table in precise order of social importance. Colonel Haines at the head, his wife at the foot. The most distinguished guests arrayed outward from them in careful gradations of rank and relationship. I had set this table myself that afternoon, laying each piece of silver with the precision of 27 years. The Haines crest caught candlelight from each place setting, 40 hawks with wings spread over 40 broken chains. I had looked at that crest one final time before the guests arrived and felt the appropriateness of it settle over me like a cloak. Service began. The turtle soup arrived perfect, rich and dark, each bowl filled from the same tureen, in the same quantity, with the same garnish. I moved around the table with the efficiency of a man who has performed this specific function thousands of times. Invisible, precise, trusted absolutely. The conversation flowed with the soup. Colonel Haines was holding court at the head of the table, telling a story about his first tobacco harvest in 1816, the year he'd taken over from his father. The guests laughed at the appropriate moments. Wine glasses were refilled. The evening had the quality of a performance going exactly according to script. I stood in my corner and watched and waited, and felt nothing but clarity. The duck arrived. More wine. The conversation shifted to politics, to the growing tensions between North and South, to the question of slavery's future that everyone in the room had opinions on and none of them wished to examine too closely. Colonel Haines spoke about the natural order of things, about biblical precedent, about the economic impossibility of any other arrangement. His guests nodded. Judge Carver offered legal perspective. Reverend Morrison provided theological support. I refilled the Colonel's wine glass, and he did not look at my hands. He never looked at my hands. The main course arrived to genuine admiration. The roasted pig was presented on its silver platter with the ceremony it deserved, carried by 2 of the strongest kitchen workers, set at the center of the table while guests exclaimed at its appearance. I carved it myself at the table, another skill accumulated over decades of invisible service, presenting each guest with their portion with the precision of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and why. Conversation peaked during the main course. The wine was doing its work. Voices grew louder, laughter more frequent. Children who'd been allowed to attend the first portion of dinner were sent upstairs. The formal distance between guests dissolved slightly, as it always did by the third course as people became briefly, simply people at a table. I watched Colonel Haines at the head of it all, flushed with wine and satisfaction, and I thought about Clara standing in the kitchen passage with flour on her hands, telling me about the child she carried. I thought about standing outside a cabin wall in December cold, listening. I thought about a breakfast table and a newspaper, and yes, sir, said to a man who couldn't be bothered to look up. The cheese and biscuits were cleared. Dessert arrived. The 3 cakes, the syllabub, the preserved fruits, coffee for those who wanted it. The port was poured. The evening had reached the moment everyone present had been anticipating. The toasts. Colonel Haines rose from his chair with the careful dignity of a large man who had drunk considerably but remained, as always, in command of himself. He held his port glass and looked around the table at 40 faces turned toward him with warmth and expectation. "My friends," he began. His voice carried easily in the candlelit room, practiced and resonant. 40 years is a long time to work a piece of ground. My father left me this land and these people, and a debt I spent 20 years clearing. What I leave my sons is something considerably better. A legacy of honest enterprise, a name worth carrying, and the certain knowledge that everything we have was built the right way, the Virginia way, with hard work and Christian virtue and proper stewardship. The table murmured appreciation. Glasses were raised slightly in anticipation of the formal toast. I stepped forward from my corner. In 27 years I had never interrupted. In 27 years I had never spoken during dinner service unless spoken to. Every person at that table registered my movement with the confused attention people give to furniture that suddenly shifts position. Colonel Haines looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in all our years together. Confusion. Pure, unguarded confusion. "Solomon?" His voice was careful. "What are you doing?" "I am completing the evening's business, sir," I said. "I apologize for the interruption. I have a document to present to the assembled guests before the toasts conclude." I reached into my jacket and removed the envelope I had kept there throughout the evening. The table was completely silent. 40 people staring at a butler who had stepped outside every boundary that governed his existence with the calm of a man who had made his peace with every consequence of this moment. I placed the envelope on the table in front of Judge Carver, the most senior legal authority in the room. "Inside you will find documentation," I said, addressing the judge directly but speaking loudly enough for the table, "of 3 property judgments issued by your court between 1844 and 1851, in each case preceded by private arrangements between yourself and Colonel Haines, conducted in this house. I witnessed each arrangement. The documentation includes the dates, the terms, and the case numbers." The silence was absolute. "Also enclosed is a letter written by Colonel Haines to Mr. Aldridge in Richmond," I continued, nodding toward the tobacco factor, whose face had gone the color of old wax, documenting an adjustment of 8% to recorded bale weights in the 1849 season. Alongside that, documentation of 200 acres transferred privately to Mr. Harlan Haines, Jr. in 1851, absent from the plantation's official accounts. Colonel Haines had not moved. He was standing at the head of his retirement table with his port glass in his hand and his face arranged in an expression I recognized immediately, though I had never seen it there before. He looked the way Clara had looked when he told her she'd been sold, like a man suddenly understanding that the ground beneath him is not what he believed it to be. "Solomon." His voice was very quiet. "You will stop now." I sat with that letter for a long time. I had not wanted Colonel Haines's death. I had wanted what I got, his name destroyed in the room where he had expected to be celebrated, the machinery of his power dismantled in front of the people who sustained it, and 89 people free before morning. Death was too simple. What I gave him was the remainder of his life in a world that had reclassified him, a world that now looked at Harlan Haines the way it had always looked at the people he had owned, and seen something diminished, something less than what had been claimed. I thought of Clara. I thought of Joseph, 14 months in the world. I thought of 4,192 dinners served in invisible silence. I thought of a breakfast table and a newspaper, and a man who could not be bothered to look up. I thought of the Haines family crest, a hawk over a broken chain. And I thought that some images contain their own endings, that the chain had always been waiting to break, that I had simply chosen the moment. I lived in Philadelphia for 31 years. I managed dining rooms, trained a generation of service staff, and occasionally spoke at abolitionist gatherings when asked, though I was not a natural orator and preferred other forms of communication. I never returned to Virginia. I had nothing to return to except graves, and I could honor those from a distance. I died on September 14, 1885, 31 years to the day after the banquet. My physician said it was my heart. My friends said it was completion. I had done what I set out to do and lived long enough to watch the world change around the fact of it. They buried me in Eden Cemetery with a stone that reads Solomon Freeman, 1803, 1885, patient, purposeful, free. This is the story of Solomon, head butler of Haines Grove Plantation in Albemarle County, Virginia, who served Colonel Harlan Beaumont Haines from 1827 until September 14, 1854. Albemarle County Courthouse records document the resignation of Judge William Carver from the county court in October 1854, citing personal reasons. Richmond tobacco industry records show a fraud settlement involving the factor Thomas Aldridge in early 1855. Douglas Haines filed freedom papers for 89 enslaved people with the Richmond courthouse on September 14, 1854, a filing that was legally contested by the Haines family and upheld by the Richmond Circuit Court in 1856. Solomon Freeman arrived in Philadelphia in November 1854 and is documented in city records as a dining room manager from 1855 onward. He died in September 1885 and is buried in Eden Cemetery, Philadelphia. His account was recorded by the Philadelphia Abolitionist Historical Society in 1878 and donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1932, where it remains among the most detailed first-person accounts of calculated resistance during the slavery era. If Solomon's story moves you, if you believe patience can be a weapon and truth can be a fire, subscribe now so you never miss another hidden history. These are the voices they tried to silence. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and tell us what struck you most. The invisible man who saw everything. The son who chose conscience over inheritance. The dinner where a legacy died between the dessert course and the toasts. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Subscribe, comment, share, and prepare for more narratives that prove the most dangerous person in any room is the one no one ever bothers to see.